Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the webinar, Strategies for Diverse Professionals Pursuing a Career in STEM, with our presenter, Meghan Anzelc. My name is Cassie Petoskey, and I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement for your Northwestern Alumni Association. We'll begin shortly, and we're so excited that Meghan can join us for this great topic. But first, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to share with you. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see that there are a few different tabs. Thank you to everyone who's chatting in where they're tuning in from, and thank you for joining us. Please send in your questions for Meghan through the Q&A tab, and we're saving plenty of time at the end of the presentation to answer these questions, so please send them in now as well as throughout the webinar. Should you experience any technical issues during the presentation, you can email the Big Marker team for further assistance at support@bigmarker.com. Lastly, a link to access the recording of the webinar will be sent to all registrants later today. Now let's move on to why we're all here. Dr. Meghan Anzelc serves as the Chief Analytics Officer for Axis Capital Holdings. In this newly created role, Dr. Anzelc is responsible for expanding and executing the strategy and roadmap for data and analytics enterprise-wide across the Axis Capital's business segments. Dr. Anzelc was promoted to Chief Analytics Officer for Axis in January 2018, following her role as the Vice President of Data and Analytics for the company's insurance segment. In her previous role, she evaluated the current data and analytics capabilities within the organization and provided strategic recommendations to further enhance these capabilities. Prior to joining Axis in May 2017, Dr. Anzelc was Vice President, Lead Data Scientist for Zurich, North America, where she led predictive analytics projects across underwriting and claims. She has also held actuarial and analytics roles at CNA and Travelers. Dr. Anzelc holds a bachelor's degree in physics from Loyola University Chicago and a master's and PhD in physics from Northwestern. She regularly participates in initiatives focused on providing relevant guidance on career planning and professional development to insurance professionals, graduate students, and postdoctoral scholars in the sciences and math. She is a member of the steering committee for the Women in Insurance Networking Group. And with that, I will pass it off. And thank you so much for being here, Meghan.
Thank you, Cassie. I'm really excited to be here. And thanks, everyone, for joining. So I'm going to talk through some strategies for underrepresented minorities and different groups of people in pursuing a career in STEM. And I'll draw on both my own experience as well as some of the other work that has been done. So to start out, a little bit of, why me? Why should you be listening to me? And why should you care? So as Cassie outlined in her wonderful intro, my educational and professional backgrounds are both focused in STEM. So my educational background in physics and my career path has really been focused on analytics and data science. I've been involved in gender equity and diversity initiatives since graduate school. So as I'm sure some of you are aware, there's a fairly small rate of women in physics, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And there are a number of underrepresented groups in physics, right? It's a predominantly white male field of study. And similarly, there are some of those same sorts of challenges in the insurance industry. So I've been involved in initiatives focused around those pieces for quite a while. And then just a word of note. So I myself am a straight white woman. I can't possibly represent the views and experiences of all straight white women, nor can I represent the views and experiences of non-straight, non-white women and men. So I'm going to do my best to represent some of the challenges, both that I've had and that I've seen others have who come from underrepresented backgrounds, but I certainly can't represent entire populations of people. All right, and then, so going a little bit through the data, we'll just spend a few minutes on this, kind of at a high level of giving some of the context for where some of my comments will be coming from. So the next few slides are really all focused from a study that was done surveying across race and gender that was conducted by APS, which is the American Physical Society, the National Professional Physics Organization. But you can see that they break it down by STEM degrees across kind of the core STEM disciplines. And so you can look at in this one, you can see that African Americans are underrepresented across all of those STEM disciplines. So you can see biology and chemistry, the rates are higher, but certainly still not close to the actual population that is college age. And then just one comment as we go through these graphs, the y-axis is not constant. So just keep that in mind. You shouldn't sort of compare side by side without taking that into account. All right, and then moving to the next slide, you can see a similar kind of graph for Hispanic Americans. So again, underrepresented across all STEM disciplines, a little more tightly concentrated, but again, the scales are a little bit different. And you can see as a fraction of population, significantly underrepresented across STEM. And then if we look at women, you can see, again, women are underrepresented across nearly all STEM disciplines. And, in particular, you can see that biology has grown, which I think is probably known by folks, especially in like the medical fields and so on. But you can see physics, which is where my background comes from, is sort of at the bottom and hasn't really changed as a fraction of population or women participating across all bachelor's disciplines. I don't have similar graphs for Native Americans or other underrepresented groups, but from some of the other things that I've seen, the statistics look very similar. So the story is the same. And I'm sure this is not a surprise to folks that are on the webinar. All right, and then some of the challenges. So I'll go through a handful of challenges that I've seen and seen others face, and then some of the solutions. So unconscious bias is one, and this is one that gets talked about in the news a lot. And we can look at how you can measure both your own unconscious bias and then how to actually overcome it. So Harvard has built a test to measure an individual's unconscious bias for a number of groups and situations. And these are part of their implicit association test. And you can actually go to their website and take these yourself. The web link is at the bottom of the slide. And the graphic that's represented on here, the font might be a little small, but I'll walk through it in a second. That's my results from a recent unconscious bias test that I completed just a few weeks ago. And so this is showing the results for their gender science test. So how you associate male and female terms with science and humanities terms. And what you can see here that summarizes kind of at the bottom is that my results show that I am slightly biased towards men and science and women and liberal arts. So meaning I tend to associate male with science terms and female with this result, so I've taken this test a few times over the last decade, and the results have stayed fairly basically the same. I always end up showing up in this bucket. And this tells you a couple of things. So it aligns to the research that says it's really, really hard to change your unconscious bias, right? So in both in kind of my intro, I'm telling you that I'm a woman. I have a strong educational and professional background in STEM, and I've been involved in diversity and gender equity initiatives for over a decade, and I still have this problem. So this isn't meant to be depressing, right? But this is just to help show the reality and some of the challenges. So what can you do about it? So really the most impactful way to overcome unconscious bias is to make it sort of in the forefront of your conscious mind. So the problem with unconscious is that by definition, you don't have a lot of control over it, and you're not aware that it's happening. And so the idea is what you need to do is pause and step back and think about the potential for your bias, whatever it is, to show up in a particular situation and then evaluate whether or not you should adjust. So for example, as a manager, when I'm managing people, I try to do this when I'm making any major decisions around my staff or team. So for example, if I'm evaluating candidates for a role, I work with the recruiting team to ensure that we have a diverse slate of candidates at each step in the process, and using the same evaluation criteria for everyone. So I will actually step back and look through both my own feedback on candidates or even others' feedback about candidates and check and see if I'm being more harsh or lenient on some people, or perhaps two candidates have very similar gaps in experience, and I'll check that I'm actually weighing those gaps in experience the same across the two candidates. So things like that. So it's actually taking time to pause and then step back and say, okay, how might this show up? And then how can I check and see if if that unconscious bias is coming forward into my decision making. So that's really what I've seen as kind of the best strategy, is to pull as much of that forward into the conscious mind as you can. This is a challenge. It takes real work to do it. But I think, those kinds of checks and validations can help correct something that is certainly an issue and a challenge that a lot of people have to deal with. Okay, so another challenge is around both stereotypes and stereotype threat. And so, this stereotype, I've got kind of the key definitions of each of these. Stereotype, I'm sure people are familiar with. Stereotype threat is where you're put in a situation where people are at risk of conforming to stereotypes about them. And this has been shown to reduce performance of individuals who are part of a negatively stereotyped group. A lot of the work on this has been done by Claude Steele, who has a really great book called Whistling Vivaldi that goes through a lot of his research. And his research really shows that when we're reminded of negative stereotypes about ourselves, we underperform. And for example, there's a stereotype that women are worse at math than men. And if women are primed with this stereotype just before they take a math test, they actually do worse on the math test. If they aren't primed, or perhaps are reminded, for example, that they're Northwestern students and therefore they're intelligent and accomplished and up to challenges and all of those things, then you find that the way that men and women perform on that math test, there are no gender differences. So it's the actual awareness of a stereotype in a particular situation that can make women perform more poorly on math tests. And if you remove that stereotype threat or that priming, then you don't see that same gender difference, which I personally find completely fascinating. So I think in my opinion, I think it's important to be aware of the effect of stereotype threat so that you can, again, kind of consciously remind yourself that stereotypes are just that, but they're fixed and simplified images, so that you can try to reduce the effect of stereotype threat on your own performance. So this is something that I kind of talk, I'll give myself a little bit of a self-talk at times. If I think I'm in a situation or I'm reminded myself of stereotypes about women or whites or, straight people, whatever it is, whatever the group is that I belong to. And I think that the negative stereotype might impact my my performance in that particular activity or whatever it is that I'm doing. Another example. So women are also allowed a really narrow range of quote unquote acceptable behavior in the workplace. So for example, I've gotten feedback that I am too emotional, and at other times I've been told I'm not emotional enough. And so for me personally, I find it helpful to recognize that stereotypes are probably playing into both pieces of feedback. And then I can take a step back and reflect on the feedback a little bit more objectively and decide what I want to do with that feedback. And sometimes that means doing something and modifying behavior. And sometimes the way in which I want to react to feedback is actually to do nothing at all. And both are okay. So another thing about stereotypes is that if you're dealing with stereotypes on a regular basis, it is exhausting. If you feel that you have to prove yourself counter to the stereotype again and again and again. So this is an area where I think self-care is really important for your own well-being, and self-care in whatever way that means to you, whatever ways work for you. But taking care of yourself is really important. Another way to reduce the impact of stereotypes include, some of the other things that I've seen in research say, having more than one person from your group represented. Now, that's not always something that you have control over, but that can help, right? You don't feel so alone and so isolated. Another is the act of passing, so either changing your behavior or appearance to conform more to whatever the dominant group is. Though this also can be exhausting and is hard on people if they're suppressing aspects of their identity. And then lastly, again, may or may not be in your control, but effectively expatriating. So leaving to other groups where the same stereotypes are reduced or don't apply. So for example, I'm somebody who's very tenacious. I know the stereotypes around women in science and math. That was not going to deter me personally from pursuing a PhD in physics. But there are others who get into programs like that and then after a while say, this is ridiculous. I don't want to deal with this day in, day out. I can be more successful elsewhere. perhaps in a field. I'm trying to think of one, but modifying a major or pursuing a slightly different career path. Where there are more people of your group in there, and so the stereotypes are not as sort of at the forefront of your experience. And then another thing that's kind of related to what we've been talking about, and certainly if there are questions about this, we can talk about it a bit more. Imposter syndrome is also related to this, but and so imposter syndrome is where you are objectively doing well in an area, but to you, you feel like you're flawed. You feel like you're fraudulent, or you don't really deserve to be there, or somebody's going to find out that you actually don't belong there, and it's all going to come crashing down. And I've had this conversation with lots of my female friends. This is something that each of us has dealt with at different points in our careers, and even when we were in graduate school and college, where we feel like we don't belong, that we're not actually good enough to be there, and somebody's going to find that out, and we're going to be uncovered. And so it's very sort of an anxiety-producing feeling. Imposter syndrome, there's at least some studies, and there's one that a friend of mine sent me that the University of Texas at Austin did, which shows that there are some differences in how different racial and ethnic groups seem to experience imposter syndrome. So if people have questions on this one, we can talk through this one a little bit more, but I just wanted to bring it up because I do think it's tied to and related to the concept of stereotypes and stereotype threat. All right, and then another challenge is discrimination and harassment. And so certainly we've seen and heard a lot about this in the news recently. The graphic I'm showing is for an LGBT study that was done for the LGBT climate in physics, again by APS. And so this is one perspective on it, but certainly there are many others. There are many forms of discrimination and harassment, and very different levels of severity. I'm certainly not an expert in this area, and I would also say I probably haven't followed my own advice sometimes when I felt like I was in situations that fall under these categories. But my thoughts on some things to consider and some things to think through. So rule number one. So this is a phrase that my father said to me growing up. And when I was 5 and about to fall off of something, so I should start at the beginning. Rule number one is to survive the experience. So that's what my dad would say. He would say, rule number one, survive the experience. And when I was a little kid and about to be in danger, it had a certain meaning. But as an adult, I still hear his voice in my head saying, remember rule number one, survive the experience. And so when you're in situations that are very difficult, I think it's important to remember that you need to do what's best for you in the moment, and make sure that you're really taking care of yourself. And then another is to really just know your rights, know who to go to. There's lots of useful information on some of the federal government sites, including USA.gov and EEOC.gov, so EEOC being the Equal Employment Opportunity Office, that describe your rights and protections, as well as provide some resources both to learn more and how to take next steps, depending upon your particular situation. And then most of us, our HR department or our university ombudsman is a key resource. Depending upon where you are, it might be unions or other employee groups can be good resources. And you could also find someone that you trust, a mentor or confidant within your organization, who might be able to help you navigate particularly more egregious situations. But I think one of the things that we've seen in the last handful of months with a lot of what's happening in the news is that speaking up is really important. We've seen this with the U.S. Olympic gymnasts. We've seen this with some of the folks in the entertainment industry in Hollywood, that the act of speaking up is incredibly powerful. And then, kind of a final reminder, sort of back to that rule number one, survive the experience. I think it's really important that you take care of yourself, again, in whatever way works for you and whatever that means to you. All right. And then I would say there's another challenge around isolation. And we talked about this, I touched on this a little bit before, in the cases where you might be the only one like you in a group. The other thing is that I think in some ways this challenge of isolation can become more an even bigger issue or more predominant as you move up in seniority. Just generally, people with positions of more in seniority tend to be more lonely. And I just have a small quote from an HBR article on CEOs. And this is right. This was an article that has nothing to do with diversity or underrepresented groups or anything like that, right? So it's certainly CEOs are predominantly male and predominantly white male, so that's really where this is coming from. But the concept that more seniority tends to make you more lonely, that there's isolation just associated with different positions as you move up in the corporate ladder. So I think this is one to be aware of and kind of keep an eye on as you progress in your career. And then I think some of the solutions around here. I think one of it is that, especially as you move into more senior roles, you may find that you end up in a bubble where everyone around you agrees with you, either because of the position of power or the role. That can happen to a lot of people as they're in very senior positions, or you might have people who are afraid to bring you bad news, which can also isolate you. So if you're not getting good information, if you're not having people disagree with you, if you don't actually know the reality of what's happening, because people are afraid to talk to you about those things, that can isolate you even further than you already had been. So in terms of ways to combat it and breaking through that bubble would be to seek perspectives that are different from your own. And I'm sure, again, this is something that's not new to people. I'm sure a lot of you already do this. But one of the ideas is sort of that team of rivals concept in the book about Lincoln as a way to bring together diverse perspectives, deliberately seeking out people's opinions and views where you know that they are different from yours, to help provide you some of that balance and a little bit different picture or perspective on how they see reality. Another approach is to find a peer group. So it could be made up of people inside your company, it could be people outside of your company, but people with whom you can be open about your challenges and fears, a group that you feel you can actually be honest and open with. I've always found this helpful throughout my career to have a few people who are sort of in the trenches with me, that I feel like they have similar challenges, they're at similar points in their careers, they're seeing similar things. And it helps me feel less alone. So I think it's a good way to combat the feelings of isolation. I would say sometimes that group, it's hard for us to come up with great solutions because it's sort of all of us in the same boat of facing the same challenges and with the same, either experiences or lack of experiences as it may be for particular situations. But it does help me feel less alone in a particular, if there's something in particular that I'm facing. And then in a similar vein, I would say broadening your network to include people from a wide range of roles at the company can also help. So meeting with people in data entry roles who are close to the points of customer interaction, that might be a person or a group of people that have very different day jobs from your own, very different views on how things are going and what's working and what's not than you do, and can give you a wealth of information about data you do have, which is relevant for my personal career, right, of the data that we collect, how it's collected, how to interpret it correctly. I've always found that spending time with the people who actually do that work to be incredibly valuable. It gives me a different perspective. It helps me understand the company from a different angle, and gets me, out there meeting different people from the people I might sort of ordinarily interact with on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so those are kind of the key challenges that I've seen and that I've seen in some of the research, and then some reminders that have helped me as I've gone through my career. So bits of advice that have really stuck with me and that I've used. And so the one on the upper left, so my dad always said when I was growing up that you have to know the rules of the game. You have to recognize that it's all a game. You are playing a game, and you need to know the rules to know how to play. And even if you decide you don't want to play, that's fine too, but it's important to know the rules so that you can make that decision intelligently. My mom's phrase on the upper right, so the illegitimate non-carborundum, is one that reminds me to keep going and not give up. So that translates to a "don't let the bastards get you down," which if you knew my mother is really funny coming out of her mouth. But it's one that, is a good reminder of just keep going, don't get too bogged down in this stuff. It can be lonely, it can be frustrating, but keep going. Ann Cuddy, again on the left, her Fake It Till You Make It, she has an absolutely wonderful TED Talk on confidence and the benefits of portraying confidence even when you aren't confident in the moment, right? So this concept of fake it till you make it. And she's done a bunch of research around this that actually shows that that is beneficial, that has real tangible benefits. Her TED Talk is really wonderful. For me, I warn people it might not be safe for work because it always makes me tear up a little bit. So just a warning there. And then in graduate school, I had the opportunity to meet with a group of Nobel laureates in Lindau, Germany. So they have this annual meeting where they bring together a huge group of prior Nobel laureates and the new winners. And I had the opportunity to attend on behalf of Northwestern. And one of the things I was surprised to find was that the most common regrets that these very highly accomplished scientists had was that they hadn't spent more time with their families. It was something that I heard over and over again from a number of the Nobel laureates. And so this was really a reminder to me as a graduate student that I need to make time for the most important people in my life. And so this is one that's really stuck with me throughout my career of, and again, kind of that concept of stepping back and looking at the bigger picture and saying, am I spending my time in the ways that I want to, that's serving what I want out of my life in total? It doesn't mean I don't have times when, certainly I'm really busy or working tons of hours or, there are patterns where sometimes I'm not spending a ton of time with my family, but I try to make sure that those are short-lived and that I balance that against spending time with the people I care most about. The quote from Rebecca Saldana I came across recently, and this is one that a few friends and I will actually share with each other, texting each other when we're dealing, with imposter syndrome ourselves or feeling sort of unequal to what we're trying to accomplish. So one of us will just text the other one, Lord, let me have as much confidence as a mediocre white guy. And then another one, the final one, I don't think I've heard this from anyone else, but this is one that I think about a lot. If you think about the major decisions in your career, so whether it's getting a job, being hired, being promoted, being fired or laid off, special project assignments, all of those decisions are made without you in the room. You don't actually get to be a part of the actual decision making most of the time. You can influence it certainly, but when the decision is made, you aren't in the room for that decision. And so I think it's also important to remember that you need to build relationships with the people who are in that room. So I think it's a dual reminder, both making sure that you build relationships with people who do make those decisions about your career. And then also a reminder that there's only so much you can control, and some of it just is out of your hands. And so, some of it you don't get to decide, which, for me is sometimes a helpful reminder that what I can do is limited in some ways. And then finally, some of the habits and the kinds of support that have made a big difference for me throughout my career. So having different networks for different purposes has helped quite a bit. So, sort of cheerleaders of people who support you, who are genuinely happy for your success, who continue to believe in you when you fail. Having a handful of people like this around me has been very helpful, both to celebrate the good times and then to have them help remind me of the things I have going for me when I fall down. Family and old friends, so people who have known me most of my life. I find it very helpful. People that I can be silent around. I can sit on a couch with and, one of my good friends, and we could sit there all day and never say a word to each other. And we're actually really enjoying each other's company. There's no need to sort of be quote unquote on with her. Or people who know me so well that I don't have to explain a lot in detail. They know me, they know the context of my life. That can be very refreshing at times and helpful, especially when going through challenging situations. And then people who will actually tell me the whole truth. You need people who will give it to you straight, who will tell you the way things are. It's important to have people like that around you so that you get a different perspective, sort of get out of your own head. And then also people who are, and I talked about this a bit before, but people who are sort of in the trenches with you in similar roles, whether they're inside or out the company. And I find those folks really helpful for both a sounding board and then just having someone who also knows what it's like to go through whatever it is I'm going through at the time. And then, like I said on the last slide, people who are influential in your career, and including some of these folks in your network. These people can give you opportunities to stretch in ways that you may not think you're ready for, but they may see things in you. And then just, help you navigate your career, make decisions, and then who can help use their positions of power and influence to advance your own career. And then again, back to the concept of self-care. So for me personally, this includes things like getting enough sleep, eating well, at least most of the time, exercising regularly. These are kind of the core pieces for me. I do occasionally take mental health days, and this goes back to, again, something that my father really encouraged when I was growing up. So I take a sick day when I really need a break, and I know that I'm not performing at my best at work, where, things are too much, whether it's work things or personal life things or both, and really just taking a day off so that I can be, kind of the person I want to be when I'm at work, and just take that break. I personally really enjoy spending times with my friends and family, so I do that a lot with my downtime, my weekends, my time outside of work. And then for me, it's also really important to have times when I can fully disconnect. So really, truly turn off the phone, walk away, disconnect from technology. And this, my husband has actually been very helpful in this. He's very good at finding vacation spots where there are both minimal activities and no internet access. And it really, those are great opportunities for me. They don't come along often, but when we do, they're really helpful for me to actually fully disconnect and really relax. So those were the slides I had prepared. I'd really like to make sure that we have lots of time for questions. So hopefully people have things they want to discuss. And Cassie, I'll turn it back over to you to help moderate the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. This has been so great, getting all this great information and advice from you. And as we get started into our questions, I definitely just want to encourage people who are on the call today to share comments, thoughts, questions with Megan as we get into this Q&A session. So Megan, I'd love to start with Gail's question about the statistics that you shared early on in the presentation. Were these stats based on the US population or were they worldwide? And can you talk a little bit about how those stats may look different in different places around the world?
Yeah, so I believe that these are US only in terms of the data that goes into this, because they do use US Census Bureau information to provide like the US college age population numbers and the bachelor's degree participation numbers. So I believe they're just US. I can double check that, and in the slides are the resources. So the actual, if you wanted to go back to the full study and where these came from on the APS website, I can certainly provide that information. In terms of how these might look different in different parts of the world, that's a good question. I don't have a ton of information on that personally. I guess I would say, certainly there are going to be different underrepresented groups. So the underrepresented groups won't always be the same depending upon where you are in the world. But I think the kind of core challenges that I talked through, those are probably, my guess would be, and I don't know this for sure, but my guess would be that those are probably similar challenges that underrepresented groups face, however you want to define underrepresented, whatever underrepresented is in that particular part of the world. So hopefully that helps a bit, Gail.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'd love to get into the isolation piece, the challenge you were talking about earlier, Megan. And I know that you had talked about finding a peer group, and that can help with the isolation piece. I'm wondering if you have advice for finding a peer group. Should it be within your organization, outside? And also, how long do you think it takes to find a peer group that you really can trust?
Okay, good questions. All right. So in terms of whether it should be inside or outside the company, I think to some extent that's up to you. And it probably varies a little bit based on the particular challenges you're facing. So if it's isolation, I'm trying to think of an example. If it's isolation and it's really tied to things that are company specific, whether it's a particular project you're working on or an aspect of the company culture or, those sorts of things, then having people inside the company might be helpful who are also aware of some of those same contextual things. On the flip side, I've also found people outside the company to be helpful because it's useful for me to get the perspective of people who are at different companies to say, what is it about my situation that's sort of at least somewhat universal that, everybody's feeling, for example, imposter syndrome when they face this particular situation? And what is it that's just, an artifact of the particular company I'm at or the particular team I'm working on? And things really are different in other companies. So I found combinations to be helpful. So I don't know that I have kind of a black and white answer there. In terms of, I think part of your question was also about how to find them. So I think, internal to your company, it's probably a little bit easier. So people who are in similar roles, so for example, I've always been on analytics teams or actuarial teams. So talking to other actuaries or other data scientists who are at a similar level of experience as me within my company, and they might work in different divisions of the company or in different physical locations. They might work in a different country even. But generally, it's pretty easy to find people who might be good peers within your company. External, sometimes I've used people in my network over time. So, people I used to work with, and if it's a particular challenge, I might reach out to somebody and say, hey, do you know anybody else who has been through something like this, or somebody at your company that I might be able to talk to? So I think I've sort of built those kinds of groups very slowly over time by building out my network. But in principle, you could use a tool like LinkedIn or the Northwestern Alumni Directory to look for people who are either working in a similar industry or have similar titles to you, who you might be able to reach out to and start a relationship, sort of deliberately with the purpose of trying to get peer level feedback and mentoring. And then in terms of how long it takes, I think some of that can be very personal. So I'm somebody, I'm very lucky in many ways. I'm from the Chicagoland area. I've stayed in the Chicagoland area. So a lot of my friends are here, long lifetime friends. I have family that's in the area. So I'm often a little bit slower to make new friends, partially because my existing social network is so strong. So for me, it takes more time to find people I'm really comfortable with. But I think that's different for others. I certainly have other friends who are very quick to identify people they get along with and can, for lack of a better word, sort of commiserate with and share challenges and information with. So I think some of that's somewhat personal.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And, based on, I'm sure the length of time, really depends on if you're going within your organization, outside, like you said, all of these different factors really play into that. But no, that's really helpful, Megan. Thank you. And kind of going into the imposter syndrome. And I know that you mentioned you've dealt with this throughout, your life at different times in your career. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you, if there's any of those situations that you may be interested in or may feel comfortable sharing with the group, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who have felt this as well. And I'm just curious if there's specific situations that could be approachable to some of these listeners on the call today.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I don't have a lot of I don't have a problem talking about my faults and failures. I'm happy to share if it will help somebody survive the experience a little bit more easily. There's sort of two instances that come to mind. One is when I was in graduate school at Northwestern. So I was in my first year of the PhD program, which is, you're taking classes full time. It's a very intense workload. The material is very challenging. For me personally, I could not have passed my courses without working very closely with study groups of other students who were part of my class. And there were a few of us that kind of halfway through the year, we were probably at least through the first quarter and maybe the second, and we were all struggling. We felt like we were barely keeping our heads above water. And we used to have conversations about when we fail out of the program, what will we do? What will our careers be? What will our lives look like? And it was a half serious conversation. And so it was that feeling of not being prepared for, not being good enough for, sort of that overwhelming amount of learning that had to be done and just feeling not up to it at all. And I remember we happened to be, a couple of us were kind of having this conversation one day, and one of the admins from the department happened to overhear us a little bit. And she said, I don't know what you guys are worried about. You guys are fine. She's like, I've seen hundreds of students through this program over the years. You guys are doing just fine. And for whatever reason, that itself was incredibly reassuring. That someone who had seen class after class of students come into the program over and over again, and whatever information she based it on, I don't know, right? Nor do I know if she was actually factually accurate, but in the moment it didn't matter. Just having someone else a little bit outside who seemed to know more about the context we were in than we did, saying, no, you're going to be fine. That helped quite a bit. It was like a mental shift and helped me sort of regain my energy to kind of push forward and keep going. Another example that comes to mind is one of the times I changed jobs and I was starting a new job at a company, and the job was significantly more responsibility than I had had before that. And it was scary. Like I was a little bit scared of, can I actually do this? So I would say that was another time where I was excited about the job, right? And I was glad that they had the confidence I could do it, and they were, gladly paying me for the responsibility. But I was less sure than they were. And so I think that one it just kind of took me some time to start getting more comfortable in the role and at the new company. But that was one when I started, it really kind of freaked me out.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And having the two, pretty different situations, that's really helpful. And jumping into the diverse perspectives that you talked about, and I know you mentioned, it's harder to get these different opinions as you move up in your career.
Mm-hmm.
How have you supported these, diverse perspectives within your teams as you've risen through your career? And have you found it important that the organizational culture supports that as well? Or can you kind of impact this on your own team?
Yeah.
Even beyond an organizational culture, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, so I absolutely, I think the organizational culture definitely plays into this. And so if it's a culture of sort of fear and kind of command and control, people are generally less willing to be open. They're less willing to share their experiences. They're definitely less willing to share bad news. So if you're in that kind of culture, it is harder. But I do think there's quite a bit you can do yourself within your immediate group. So both, your direct team, as well as, the people you work most closely with. So from my perspective, I've seen a few things that are helpful for this. So one is, if there is a component where people are afraid to bring bad news and they're actually validated in that fear, right? If you get really upset when people bring you bad news or things that you don't want to hear, if you get visibly angry or frustrated, If you take it out on the messenger, right, people will not bring you bad news. So you have to check that your own behavior is in line with what you're looking for from people. So I'm very lucky. I'm somebody who's very level-headed, so this is a little bit easier for me than it is for some others. But I'm pretty good at kind of holding my emotions in check when somebody's bringing me information I don't really want, and kind of taking a deep breath. Now, I might still be angry and frustrated, and I might need to go somewhere else and kind of, get that out of my system, or I might need to find someone, for example, from that peer group to, call up and have, kind of vent to a bit, but away from the person who is delivering the message. So I think that's one, is kind of checking your behavior. I think the other is really, and this is kind of related again, is really being genuine in your interest in getting information and perspectives that are different from yours. And this takes time, and especially in cultures where this is not the norm, people will be skeptical and distrustful of that at the beginning, and it may take, chunks of time for them to see that over and over again you actually are interested in hearing about what others think. And then I think the other part of it is, do you ever modify your viewpoint or the action you're going to take based on what someone else tells you? Right? If you do, then that's a good, strong validation for people that you are interested in other perspectives, you're listening to those perspectives, and then you're actually adjusting your approach or your decision or your action based on the information you got from others, right? Which then people are more interested in providing you that because they see that they're being helpful. They see that they're being influential. So I think some of it is building that over time. And then some of it is in the language you use. So I use a couple of phrases pretty frequently where if I think my viewpoint is different from other people's and I want to check and see what other people think, I will ask the question, how do you see things differently? And that phrasing presumes that the other person sees things differently than me. So it's a little bit different language than saying, does anybody disagree, right? Which is a little bit more confrontational. And it's a little bit different language from, does someone else have a different view, right? Which is a better one. But the how do you see things differently sort of automatically says, you probably have a different perspective, and I'd like to hear from you what that perspective is. So I think those are parts of it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. How do you see things differently? No, that's great. Awesome, Megan. This is such helpful advice, and like you break it down so well. And kind of diving into the concept you were talking about, where a lot of the decisions made around your career are with you not in the room. And I know you mentioned like developing these relationships with supervisors who make these decisions about your career. And how have you kind of built those relationships, also knowing, or not ostracizing yourself from other colleagues who,
good question.
who may also be trying to do the same thing and get ahead in their career, and with that competitive environment.
Sure.
I don't know if you can talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's okay. So I'll take those two pieces separately. So in terms of how to start building relationships with the people who are influencing the decisions about your career. So every boss I've ever had, I have regular one-on-ones with. Most of the managers I've had have done that as a natural part of their management style. Some have been less crazy about it, and I've been diplomatic, but effectively pushed them to do it and said, no, I am worth your time. I want whatever it is, 30 minutes once a week, or 30 minutes every other week, or 60 minutes, whatever the need is, and I need this time with you. So at minimum, meeting with your direct manager. I have also always had what are called skip levels, which is meeting regular one-on-one meetings with the person who is one step removed in your management chain. So for example, with my boss's boss. So again, every job I've had, every company I've worked in, I have had recurring skip levels with that person. And these, sometimes it takes me a little while to get these set up. Those, folks, when you're talking about 2 levels higher than you in an organization, they are very busy. They have a lot on their plates. most people have been pretty open to it because most people actually don't ask. So the fact that I asked, and I was one of only maybe a handful of people that asked, meant that I got on the schedule. If all, however many 100 people had asked for it, I might not have ever been able to have those meetings. So sometimes just asking for them can make it happen. The other is that I try to ensure that when I have those sorts of meetings, that they are mutually beneficial. So in the first one, I will talk to the person about what is the information that I have that might be most helpful to them, and what kind of perspectives can I share that would be helpful to them. And remember this part about isolation, right? In senior positions, and it can be difficult to get good information. So sometimes offering that, of saying, hey, I can give you the perspective of what people at my level in this team or this division are seeing about the organization, how we're feeling about it, and I'm happy to share some anonymized, summarized version of some of that, if that would be helpful to you, right? And for a lot of senior executives, that kind of information is really useful. But certainly also using it to talk to them about the perspective they have. And they have a different one. It's a much higher level, sort of bigger picture view, but asking them questions along those lines. And then they get to know you over time, right? And sometimes that turns into, when there's a conversation and your name is brought up, they know who you are. Or it may be that if they're looking for someone to attend a conference or participate in a project, they might think of you a little bit more quickly than some other people that they may not know as well. And then I also try to have regular meetings with people who are like my boss's peers, to sort of that level, because those tend to be the people who are sitting in the room making a lot of the decisions about special assignments and promotions and some of those things. And often those people sit in different functions or in different divisions of the company. And so they can offer a completely different view on, some of the priorities, what their teams are working on, those kinds of things. And if you're only moving one level in the management chain, sometimes it's a little bit easier to get time with those folks on a regular basis. The second part of your question, Cassie, about how do you do that without, and sort of navigate your own peer group and how people might perceive that. I've had different experiences over the years. So to be totally frank, some people have not been happy. Some of my own peers have been not happy about how I did things. They didn't think I deserved that executive's time, or they were jealous because they couldn't also get those meetings. I've seen some of that happen over the years in different companies in different roles. I've also had people, there are some people who just actually don't want that kind of visibility at all. Sitting with their boss's boss would freak them out, and whatever the value is, that to them it's not worth whatever they see. So there's, I found people too who are not only not jealous, but actually actively wouldn't want to do things the way that I'm doing them. And then certainly I've had people sort of all in between that. So hopefully so I guess to your question of, how do you deal with that? I think I try to be open and honest with people about, how I set up those meetings, or what we talk about, things like that. But the people who have been sort of most against it, or most vocally, upset with the way that I've done things, I think there's a certain part of it that I feel like I just need to, I can't control their reaction. And if I think the value I'm getting out of it outweighs whatever downside there is in terms of a couple of people in my peer group, then I will, sort of keep going with what I've set up and how I'm approaching things. If I feel the other way, if I feel like there's a real detriment to some part of my peer group that I think that is greater than the benefit I'm getting, then I might reassess and try to do it differently. Luckily, I haven't really felt like I've been in that position.
Yeah.
Hopefully that helps.
That is great, Megan. And I love this concept of skip level meetings. Now, did this just come naturally to you and you're thinking about strategy in your career and taking the next steps? Or where did you come up with the,
how
meeting?
Did I start doing that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So in my first job, the short answer is I don't entirely remember, because at the time it didn't seem like I don't know. I wasn't aware of kind of what I was doing, I guess, to some extent. In my very first job, one of the women who worked in our recruiting team, who worked in the same office as me, she had encouraged me to set up skip levels with the person who was running our division at the time. And she said, I think you'd really like him. I think you'd get a lot out of meeting with him. You should ask him. And at the time, he worked in a different office. So she was like, when you visit that office, you should see if you can set up time with him. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of like, really? You think he really wants time with me? I mean, I'm not anybody, And she was like, no, I think it would be really good. I think you should do it. And so I reached out and said, hey, would you have 30 minutes? I'm going to be in town, visiting your office. And he said, sure, absolutely, come on by. And I definitely prepared for that first meeting to kind of think about what I wanted to talk about, how I might be able to negotiate setting up recurring ones. And he was one of the people who said, you're one of the only people that asks. And so I make time for it on my calendar for the people that ask. But not everybody asks, so it's actually manageable for me. There's only a handful of people that, sort of at your level that I meet with. So it was sort of someone encouraging me to do it, and then trying it once. But I've actually found throughout my career, almost anybody will give you a half hour of their time once.
Yeah. No, that's great, Megan. This is so helpful. And I'd love to get one more question in before we get to closing notes. Jamie is writing in. She is a female grad student at Northwestern in predictive analytics, and she's getting ready to have or to interview for jobs this fall. And this will represent a career change for her. As a woman, how do you balance faking it till you make it with appearing overconfident in an interview, especially if you're relatively less experienced?
Okay, sure. Great question, Jamie. Okay. So a couple of points on this. So one is I actually had this conversation with a couple of the women who did some of the research in the confidence gap. And I'd have to go back and dig out which university they were associated with. But they had done a presentation at like a women in leadership conference that I had attended a few years ago. And they were talking about the confidence gap and how women need to be more confident. And I came up to them after the talk and I said, I get it. Like, I understand the data you're showing. I understand what you're saying. I said, but does this really apply to everybody? Are like, really? I said, because I'm a pretty confident person. Like, are you telling me that even I need to be more confident? And they said, yes, that is right. Even though you are already confident, there is still probably a gap for you and you could probably be even more confident. I said, oh, okay. All right, good to know. And I think too that quote from the female senator about or female state representative about having the confidence of a mediocre white guy sort of is a good level set to say, am I being as confident as the person sitting next to me? And sometimes I find that when I ask myself that question, the answer is no, and so I probably need to be more confident. So I guess, Jamie, I would say you're probably not in danger of being overconfident. But I would suggest that that you think about being, I guess for me, so when I was in your situation, I tried to be clear with people about what I thought I offered and the skills that I had to offer them as a potential employer. And I was equally clear about what I didn't have. So I didn't lie about skills that I didn't have. I didn't, I would be clear about, so for example, my first job out of graduate school was with Travelers, and they were using a programming language that I didn't know at all. And so I was clear with them on that in the interview. I said, I know these other programming languages and I'm pretty solid in them. But one of the things I will need to learn if you give me the job is I'll need some time to learn this programming language. I'm confident that I can learn it, and I think I can learn it pretty quickly because I've learned 3 or 4 languages over the course of my graduate school years. But that's a gap for me, right? So I think that being confident that I could do it, but also being open about sort of where my starting point was. So I would suggest that might be an approach to think about, or something along those lines. And I think certainly confidence in your skills and abilities is going to be hard for you to probably overdo. But certainly you don't want to have your behavior come across as, really egotistical or that you're better than everybody else. And I'm sure that's not what you're doing. But I think if you were to veer into that kind of behavior, then I would say now you're appearing overconfident to the interviewers. So hopefully that helps. I think probably for yourself, your own mental images and how you're feeling about things, it's probably going to be difficult for you to be overconfident in your own abilities and your own contributions you can make to the employer. So I wouldn't worry so much about that angle.
Yeah, Megan, this has been so helpful, and thank you again for sharing all of this great information and providing all of this, valuable advice to our group today. Do you have anything else you'd like to share with the group before we end for the day?
I really appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I hope people found this helpful. I think, hopefully through both the slides and some of the commentary, it helps you feel a little bit less alone with maybe some of the things you're going through. And I think that's, kind of my core message is that there are people out there who have been through what you're going through. And it can be really helpful to try to find some of those folks and realize that some of this is, it's really not you yourself. I always say it's nice to know that I'm not crazy. Finding people who are going through similar things as me. So I think that's kind of my core message is finding those people that you can talk to and navigate with and share experiences with. I think is incredibly helpful for overcoming some of these challenges.
Yeah, thank you again, Megan, for the presentation and answering everyone's questions at the end. And thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar. To find all of our archived and upcoming webinars, you can go to our website at alumni.northwestern.edu/career webinars. Have a great rest of your day and go Cats.